Violence is a tool in the Mafia. It's not lashed out in the heat of the moment. Every violent act pulled by a mobster is done meticulously. It's well thought out, and there is always a reason behind it. Power is everything to these men, and they will use fear and intimidation to maintain control. The more people that fear them, the stronger their influence is. In some cases, Mafia hits are quick and precise, but there are only certain times those assassinations send the right message across. When these notorious criminals really want their enemies to feel the sting of their effect, they turn to torture techniques to leave their mark. This can send messages to their enemies, letting them know the carefully orchestrated attacks weren't random acts of violence. Torture is executed throughout the mob for various reasons, whether it's to extract information or as an act of revenge. Anyone associated with the Mafia could be on the receiving end if they find themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's not just rivals and informants who are at risk. Even Mafia families' inner members could be at the other end of these violent acts if there's reason to believe betrayal is in sight. In today's video, we're going to explore some of the most brutal Mafia torture techniques to have been executed. Different gangs and families were known to have their own signature torture methods. Let's take a look at 10 techniques that left our skin crawling, starting with the classic ice pick. One of the most infamous weapons used in the Mafia was the ice pick. This method is one of the more common ones used by American mobsters. Throughout history, many famous mobsters have made the ice pick their weapon of choice, like Abe Kid Twist Relez, Israel Ice Pick Willie Alderman, and Frank Abendondo, just to name a few. But Murder, Inc., a notorious crime group from New York in the 1930s and 1940s, were most famous for making use of this stealthy weapon. While an exact number isn't known, this group is believed to be responsible for over 1,000 murders, many of them executed with an ice pick. The ice pick was seen as a more effective weapon than a knife for instilling fear. The needle-like shaft made it easier for mobsters to get past the bones and puncture their victims' organs. Of course, each notorious mobster who used this weapon has their own unique killing style. Ice Pick Willie would drive the ice pick into his victim's ears, while Frank Abendondo would use the weapon to puncture his victims' hearts. This effective weapon of choice was also easy for mobsters to work with. Ice picks are easy to find and conceal. Unlike having a gun or axe, they can walk around in plain sight carrying an ice pick without raising any suspicion. The ice pick is also silent, allowing the hitman to take care of business without drawing a lot of attention. As we've covered Mafia crimes throughout history, one thing that we've noticed is how good these guys are at making people vanish. There have been so many cases where someone who was connected to the Mafia just disappeared without a single trace. No evidence of a crime scene, and the body was never found. Of course, there have been many different and creative ways the Mafia has made this happen, but one that absolutely blew our minds was the cement shoes. Basically, the mobsters will put a pair of cement or concrete shoes on their victims and dump them in the water. There have been stories of victims being thrown into the water while they're still alive, making the process even more terrifying. Now, to be specific, these aren't sneakers made of concrete. The victim will be forced to put their feet into boxes or buckets that the mobsters will fill with cement. Knowing their fate and not being able to do anything about it adds a level of horror we can't even begin to describe. For decades, stories of cement shoes were part of Mafia lore. It wasn't until 2016 that the first documented case of a cement shoe victim was discovered. The body of a Brooklyn gangster, Peter "Petey" Crack Martinez, washed up on the Manhattan beach. Now, typically, this method ensures that the body will sink to the bottom of the lake, but the gangsters who attempted to pull this hit off made one serious mistake. They didn't give the concrete enough time to dry in the barrel before they threw it in the water. His body floated to shore where it was discovered. However, the motive behind his death still remains a mystery, but it's believed that he owed a lot of money to the wrong people. This just shows how devious gangsters will be when they've been wronged. A silent killing is one of the most terrifying. Many of the most notorious Mafia hitmen throughout history, like Albert Anastasia, were known for their abilities to pull off the silent kill. Now, we talked about the ice pick. That was a common weapon for silent kills, but the most skilled Mafia hitmen used a sneakier technique called the Garant Wire. The phrase "killed with a garrote" is common in Mafia lore. It's so common that it's one of those phrases that people say without really knowing the true meaning behind it. As we did some deeper research into what a garrote kill really is, we discovered it's one of the most discreet ways to kill a person. Okay, so a garrote refers to a strong wire, usually made from steel. Mobsters would use piano wire, fishing line, or any other wire that was strong enough to get the job done. But only the stealthiest of hitmen could pull this technique off. Why is that? Well, they had to get very close to their victim and be strong enough to overpower them. The wire wasn't as fast as the ice pick, but it was a lot cleaner. It was the weapon of choice for hitmen that could pull off a sneak attack from behind. The one challenge with the garrote wire is getting a good grip, so mobsters would usually tie a piece of piping to each end of the wire. This way they could maintain control as their victim was fighting to get free. This is one torture technique the victim never sensed was coming. Mafia torture isn't always about killing the victim. Sometimes it's done to send a warning, like we can do a lot worse if you don't cooperate. Other times it's done to get information out of people. When the Mafia needs to use violence to send these types of messages, they tend to go for torture techniques that don't kill but are just as frightening. One such technique is baseball bat beatings. Okay, so if this technique is taken far enough, it can kill. But most of the time, the goal is to leave the victim crippled in fear, unless they fold and cooperate immediately. Baseball bat beatings have been a part of Mafia torture since the beginning of time. This technique is most notably famous through Al Capone. There are many stories of him beating his victims with a bat, but the wild thing about this is that they are all urban legends. You see, Al Capone was known for his violence, so it's highly likely he could have been beating men with baseball bats. After all, he was known to inflict violence on business owners who turned down his bootlegging offers. But there hasn't been any concrete evidence to support the myths of these beatdowns. Now, Al Capone's reign of terror dates all the way back to the 1920s, but the baseball bat beating technique is still alive today. In 2023, 10 members of the Gambino crime family were brought to trial for extortion. Mobsters were using threats of violence to extort money from a hauling company. There was one accusation in particular where the victim claims a Gambino captain, Diego Danny Tantillo, arrived at the office with a metal baseball bat demanding $1,000. This classic technique may still be used today, but it landed these mobsters in some hot water. Burns can cause severe injuries with an intense level of pain. That's what makes cigars, cigarettes, and fire torture so effective for the Mafia. Victims feel the effect as the burning object gets closer to them. It can be one of the most effective ways to get information quickly, and it can also be one of the deadliest ways to take out an enemy. Let's start with cigars and cigarette burns. Now, we don't have any documented cases of this torture technique, but it has been shown time and time again throughout Mafia movies. We can only imagine the filmmakers were inspired by stories they have heard of Mafia legends. Actor Joe Pesci brought this classic torture scene to the screen in Goodfellas when his character used a cigarette to intimidate another mobster. He pulled out the fire again in Casino when his character burnt a man with a cigar as punishment. This is a highly effective technique because it causes immense pain without killing anyone. There have also been cases of mobsters using arson as a means to send a message. This is a common method when gangs want to extort business owners or punish people who refuse to pay protection money or owed money. American Mafia families have been using this form of intimidation throughout history. In 2011, 16 indictments were filed against 127 members of the Northeast American Mafia. Arson was just one of many charges. Next is one of the most gruesome forms of Mafia torture. Just thinking about this one makes our skin crawl. The mobsters that take the most extreme measures of torture without killing would subject their victims to denailing, otherwise known as nail removal. Without going into too much detail about this ghastly method, torturers would use pliers to remove victims' fingernails and toenails. Now, this is one of the less common torture techniques utilized by the Mafia. They would resort to denailing for crucial situations, like when they needed to extract a confession from another mobster who betrayed the crime family, or to get valuable information from rivals. If someone wasn't willing to talk, this is one technique that could get the mobster exactly what they needed. This torture tactic is used when crime groups need to break a traitor or enemy down psychologically. Between the overwhelming pain and the extreme feeling of fear and helplessness, the victim is more likely to cave in and speak. Most stories of Mafia denailing are part of lore. There have been talks about the Sicilian Mafia and 'Ndrangheta using denailing for brutal interrogation. This wouldn't surprise us, as both these Mafia are known for their ruthless and barbaric tactics. Throughout history, members of the Sicilian Mafia have used extreme violence to enforce silence. The 'Ndrangheta is one of the most secretive organized crime groups in the world. They have the power to pull off some of the most savage acts without anything coming to light. This next torture technique is one we wouldn't wish on our worst enemies. Mobsters have been creative with how they send messages and get information. They take intimidation to the next level, especially when they need to get information from people. The hot seat is a classic tactic that involves placing the victim on a burning hot metal chair. Sometimes the chair will be heated to a scalding hot temperature. Other times it's placed directly over an open flame. No matter which version of the heat seat a crime group uses, one thing is the same: the victim feels an unbearable level of pain. American Mafia groups have been using this torture tactic for decades throughout history. The unpredictable nature of this brutal act affects the victim physically and psychologically. It's a level of pain most people cannot withstand, leading to the victims being unable to resist confessing or spilling the information the Mafia is looking for. The longer a metal chair is exposed to heat, the hotter it will become. Just think about how hot a metal seat can get on a sunny day. Now, you can probably imagine how excruciating the pain would be on a metal chair that was placed over an open flame for an extended period of time. The Moscow Mafia has taken inspiration from the drastic torture technique and made radioactive hot seats. In 1993, it was discovered that members of the Moscow Mafia were inserting radioactive devices into chairs to assassinate victims. This was discovered after a device killed a businessman and other members of his staff fell violently ill. One of the frightening things about the Mafia is how they are always a step ahead with reinventing their techniques. Just when you think one torture technique is scary enough, they make it 10 times more horrifying. There are various ways that the Mafia has used water to torture victims. This is one of the simplest but also most effective ways. They can use different water torture processes to cause mental stress to get a victim to speak. Let's start with the Chinese water torture. This practice is when cold water is slowly dripped over a victim's head for a longer period of time. Sure, it may not sound as horrible as some of the other techniques we mentioned in this video, but it leads to extreme mental stress. While this method can mentally wear a victim out, there are other factors that lead to their ultimate breakdown and surrender. When crime groups use this tactic, they strap their victim up to a restraining device. This device causes even more stress than the water dripping. Waterboarding is another scary tactic the Mafia will use for torture. This is a cruel, heinous act in which a victim is laid on a board with their head tilted towards the ground. They are strapped on the board so they cannot move. Their head will be lowered into the water, simulating the effects of drowning. Water fills their sinuses, trachea, larynx, and pharynx, so they are unable to breathe. Forms of water torture can leave a person feeling disorientated. Even the most stubborn victim could give in under this type of torture. It's also easier for gangsters to get away with water torture because it leaves no significant signs of physical damage, unlike burning or denailing. It's not just the criminal underworld that has adopted the water torture technique. There have allegedly been incidences of water torture for interrogation from the Army, Central Intelligence, and other forces you wouldn't expect. Even back in 1983, a Texas sheriff and 3 deputies were charged after it was discovered that they handcuffed prisoners to chairs, placed towels on their faces, and started pouring water on them to get confessions. The next torture tactic we're going to delve into shocked people into confessing. That's right, painful electric shocks can scare the story out of the most hard-headed victims. Gangs, cartels, and mafia families are all known to utilize electric devices to torture their victims. They use everything from power tools and medical devices to makeshift electric chairs to get intel information. Let's take former Philadelphia Mafia hitman Joe Veazey. He was an enforcer who would use a power drill to intimidate his victims. During former mob boss John Stanfa's trial in 1995, Veazey gave counts on how he used a power drill to intimidate a mob associate who threatened his life. He claimed to put the drill in the victim's hair first, instilling fear as the hair came out in clumps. He then started drilling other parts of the victim's body until his drill broke. Electric torture isn't exactly lethal, but it can cause damaging effects. In the beginning, victims break down because it can cause extreme emotions and makes them feel weak and tired. If it goes on for too long, it can cause damage to the lungs and brain cells, possibly even affecting the victim's memory. While mobsters have been using electric devices to terrorize victims throughout history, there is one ironic twist to this method. A trio of members from Murder Inc. were put to death by the electric chair at Sing Sing prison in 1944. When Louis Capone, Louis Lepke Buckhalter, and Emmanuel Mendy Weiss were executed, this long-feared gang also came to an end. The final torture technique in our video is one of the most common forms of mafia torture, breaking bones. Let's face it, throughout history, some of the most notorious gangsters found thrills in the acts of violence. Breaking down a rival brought them even more joy than the money they earned from the contract. This is what makes these men so terrifying. Torture is like an art to them. These hard criminals would bring about bats, sledgehammers, and other blunt instruments and weapons to break the bones of their victims, smashing hands, feet, and even kneecaps to instill fear and get a confession. Bone-breaking torture has been portrayed in several gangster and mafia films. One of the most chilling scenes that sticks out to us is in the movie The Departed, when Jack Nicholson plays a mob boss who enlists his enforcer to take a cast off a man's broken hand and then beats it with a boot. While this is a fictional scene, it shows the real side of how gruesome mob bosses and enforcers will get when they want information. Strength and strategy have always played a role in mafia power. When these figures can enforce violence strategically, they can maintain control. Violence through breaking bones sends a very strong message of what the crime family is capable of doing if someone betrays them or withholds information. These are just 10 of the mafia torture techniques that crime families utilize to maintain power and control. When an associate or member of the family betrays the crime group, one of these techniques is put to work to send a clear message: never screw over the mob. Other times, mobsters will use torture as a way to get someone to speak. This is usually the case when they need to get information out of someone, such as financial secrets or informant identities. In the criminal underworld, violence can be taken to extreme measures. These men are not afraid to go the extra mile when a message needs to be sent. From burning to drying, and every gory thing in between, mafia torture techniques keep getting more extreme. While mafia torture has settled down in recent years, the impact of its legacy still lingers in organized crime. When mafia organizations have their sights set, no lengths are too extreme for them to go. Anyone who crosses their bad side could meet their reign of terror. This is all for today. We hope you enjoyed today's video and want to thank you for sticking with us to the end. Which one of these mafia torture techniques do you think is the most chilling? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Also, make sure you hit like, share, and subscribe to see more Mafia Mystique content.